I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture about the case Yakus versus United States, a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1944 that highlights the evolving non-delegation doctrine. Now, for my students, this is a case that we talk about or is relevant for both administrative law and statutory interpretation or regulation. It's not a lead case in the casebooks I use for those courses, but it's discussed extensively, or there's long excerpts from it in the materials between the cases. And the Supreme Court continues to cite this case to this day. So let's look at the decision and see what happened. It's a useful bit of background for understanding the non-delegation doctrine, which otherwise can be very confusing. So the main takeaway here is that the Supreme Court analyzed a non-delegation issue with a statute, but it didn't do so in terms of the separation of powers or the vagueness of the statute. And those are how the court had been handling non-delegation cases in the late 30s and early 40s. Instead, here, the court looked at whether there were sufficient safeguards in place to ensure meaningful judicial review to prevent abuses of government power. The bottom line here is that this case marks a retreat. It's really a turning point in the development of the non-delegation doctrine, where it seemed like after Yakus, any statute would be good enough, and that the intelligible principles test was very, very easy to satisfy. So in a sense, it's a retreat from the sort of New Deal era non-delegation doctrine. So let's talk about the statute for just a minute, because it actually matters to the continuing legacy of this case. During World War II, Congress enacted an Emergency Price Control Act to help ration goods, including food, and to stop runaway inflation. During wartime, it's very common that there's shortages of consumer goods like gasoline and milk and other foods, and spiraling prices, consumer prices. And this is due to a variety of factors: the disruptions in the supply chain, embargoes, a lot of resources are being diverted to the armed forces to feed and clothe the troops and so forth. For one reason or another, though, we get skyrocketing prices for consumers. So Congress created the Office of Price Controls to set maximum prices, or ceilings, that wholesalers and retailers could charge for certain items. In other words, you knew how much something was going to cost when you went to the store. At the same time, they would issue people coupons or vouchers for how much you were allowed to buy in a given week or month. So you were sure of your price, that the prices wouldn't go up, but you might only be allowed to buy a certain amount of milk or beef or cereal or things like that in a given week, because you would have these coupons. And that brings us to our defendants, who ended up taking the case to the Supreme Court: Albert Yakus and his co-defendants. And they were wholesalers. So they were selling to the stores or retailers, and they were convicted of selling beef above the price limits. And when they appealed their convictions, they didn't try to deny what the government said they did. They actually challenged the legality of the statute itself. They claimed that the statute violated the non-delegation doctrine and was therefore unconstitutional, and therefore, because the statute was invalid, their conviction should be overturned or reversed. The court disagreed and held that the Price Control Act was fine. It was not an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the president or the executive branch. And the rationale here is the interesting part of the case, because the majority opinion says that the act provided standards that the Office of Price Controls should use in setting maximum prices, and that those standards were clear enough to enable Congress and the courts and the public to assess the agency's conformity to the statutory guidelines. And so just to stop for a second and think about this or explain it, they're still talking about intelligible principles in the statute, like they always had for non-delegation cases. But now we're not looking at it just sort of on the face of the statute or the plain meaning. We're looking at it through the eyes of the people that would be reviewing the executive branch. So Congress and the courts and the public, the voters basically, who would then check and see if this agency, this Office of Price Controls, had gone rogue because we had sufficient standards. So it's looking for intelligible principles from sort of a different vantage point. And pull out a quote from the majority opinion that sort of captures the reasoning of the court. The standards prescribed by the present act, with the aid of the statement of considerations required to be made by the administrator, are sufficiently definite and precise to enable Congress, the courts, and the public to ascertain whether the administrator, in fixing the designated prices, has conformed to those standards. Hence, we are unable to find in them an unauthorized delegation of legislative power. Now, there's a long, impassioned dissenting opinion in this case that argued that the act was, in fact, had unconstitutionally delegated legislative power to the agency. And the way it argues this is it catalogs numerous ways in which the statute gave overly broad discretion to the administrator, and then argued that there was actually very limited judicial review available, and that it was so limited that provided inadequate safeguards against abuse. And this actually, the dissent in Yakus reads more like the majority opinion in Schechter Poultry. And so this is more of the traditional non-delegation approach that the court had been using a few years before. So from a historical standpoint, the Yakus decision really signaled the court's retreat from the non-delegation doctrine, at least as it had applied it a few years before. Why? Well, there had been a little bit of turnover on the court, but the big issue was that World War II provided a new justification for Roosevelt's economic reforms and control of the economy. And so even as recently as 2019, when the US Supreme Court talks about the Yakus case, it is quick to mention that that was a case set in the kind of height of World War II, when it was extenuating circumstances and everything needed to be done quickly and expeditiously and so forth. But the real takeaway about Yakus, its significance, is that after this case, the court basically started rejecting non-delegation claims. And it seemed like through the lens of this case that any statute would work. Also, the lower court decisions subsequently interpreted Yakus to hold that agencies could save a constitutionally dubious delegation through the agency's own narrow interpretation of the statute. In other words, if the agency engaged in some self-restraint and construed its own enabling statute narrowly, then maybe that would cure a constitutional defect. And again, for 50 years after this case and the passage of the Administrative Procedure Act, courts regularly rejected or struck down non-delegation challenges to statutes. Now, in 2001, in Whitman versus American Trucking Associations, a case that we studied both in administrative law and in statutory interpretation regulation, or Leg-Reg, Justice Scalia actually denied that that's what was going on in Yakus. So Yakus was sort of reinterpreted by the Supreme Court starting in 2001. He said the Supreme Court had never adopted a rule that agencies could cure delegation problems in their statutes themselves. Here's his quote: "We have never suggested that an agency can cure an unlawful delegation of legislative power by adopting in its discretion a limiting construction of the statute." So this signals at least a retreat from the interpretation that lower courts have been giving to Yakus for many years and in between, although Yakus is still good law and it still gets cited today. And that concludes our little lecture about Yakus versus the United States.